Have you ever sent your child somewhere believing they'd be treated like family, only to discover they were treated like a stranger? What would you do if your son came home, his voice shaking, and whispered something so painful that it froze your heart harder than the winter outside? And let me ask you this, backhand index pointing right, is silence the right response when humiliation wears the mask of family tradition? Backhand index pointing right, or is speaking up the only way to protect dignity? Before you judge this story, before you take sides, ask yourself one thing: if this happened to your child, what would you do? Backhand index pointing down, comment below, because by the end of this story, your answer may change forever. The cold that wasn't just the weather. The night my son came home, I knew something was wrong before he said a word. He didn't slam the door. He didn't throw his jacket on the chair like he always did. He didn't even look at me. He stood there, still, as if the cold outside had followed him in. I remember glancing at the clock, 9:43 p.m. Too late for a simple dinner. Too early for a broken heart, or so I thought. I asked him, "Did everything go okay?" He nodded first. Then shook his head. That contradiction, that tiny moment, that's when fear settled in my chest. He walked closer, lowered his voice like someone might overhear, even though we were alone, and whispered, "Mom, they ate inside the restaurant." I didn't understand at first. Who ate inside? I asked. He swallowed hard. They did. Aunt, uncle, everyone. I waited. My heart already knew what was coming, it just wasn't ready to accept it. He continued, his breath uneven. They told me to wait outside. Said it wouldn't take long. I felt something snap. Outside, in December. 50°. I asked, slowly, carefully, as if speaking louder would make it worse. How long? He hesitated. Then whispered the words that changed everything. 2 hours. I couldn't breathe. 2 hours. In freezing cold. While others ate, laughed, stayed warm. And the worst part? He wasn't angry. He was embarrassed. He thought he had done something wrong. He told me how he stood near the glass window, pretending to look at his phone so people passing by wouldn't think he was homeless. How the cold seeped through his shoes. How his fingers went numb. How every time the door opened, warm air brushed his face, then disappeared again. Inside, he could see them. Plates arriving. Smiles. Conversations. No one waved. No one checked. Not once. I asked him the question that still haunts me. Why didn't you come home? He looked at me and said, I didn't want to embarrass you. That sentence destroyed me. Because that's when I realized, this wasn't just about a restaurant. This was about worth. About belonging. About teaching a child that their comfort matters less than other people's convenience. And somewhere between that freezing sidewalk and my living room, my son learned a lesson I never wanted him to learn. Thought balloon viewer question. Backhand index pointing right, should a child ever be asked to tolerate humiliation just to keep peace in the family? Backhand index pointing right, would you have waited, or walked away? Backhand index pointing down, tell me in the comments. Your voice matters here. The cold that wasn't just the weather. The night my son came home, silence walked in with him. Not the peaceful kind. The heavy kind, the kind that presses against your ears and tells you something has already broken. He didn't take off his shoes. Didn't ask what was for dinner. Didn't even complain about the cold, and that's when I knew, this wasn't normal. I stood there, watching my own child look like a guest in his own home. Are you okay? I asked. He nodded. Then shook his head. Then finally whispered, can I sit down first? That question alone terrified me. He sat at the edge of the couch, hands buried inside his sleeves, shoulders hunched forward, as if he were still standing outside in the cold. I waited. I didn't rush him. Mothers know, some truths need space before they can breathe. Then he leaned closer to me and whispered, as if the walls might judge him. They ate inside the restaurant, while I waited outside. At first, my mind rejected the sentence. It didn't make sense. Families don't do that. Relatives don't do that. Normal people don't do that. What do you mean? I asked. He swallowed hard. They said there wasn't enough space. Said it would just take a few minutes. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. How long were you outside? I asked. He looked down. 2 hours. 2 hours. In 5-degree weather. I felt rage rise, but stronger than rage was guilt. Because I was the one who told him to go. I was the one who said, "They're family, you'll be fine." He told me how he stood near the glass window, watching steam rise from plates he wasn't allowed to touch. How strangers walked past him, some staring, some avoiding eye contact, probably assuming he was waiting for charity, not family. He told me how his phone battery died halfway through, and after that, there was nothing to distract him from the cold. I kept thinking they'd come out any minute, he said. So I didn't leave. That sentence hurt more than the cold ever could. Because it wasn't obedience. It was hope. Hope that someone would remember him. Hope that someone would say, "Why is he still outside?" No one did. I asked him, quietly, "Did anyone check on you?" He shook his head. Not once. I closed my eyes, because if I didn't, I knew I would scream. He said at one point he went numb, not emotionally, but physically. His fingers stopped hurting. His feet stopped hurting. And that scared him more than the cold. I thought something was wrong with me, he whispered. That's when I broke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Internally. Because a child should never blame himself for other people's cruelty. I wrapped him in a blanket that night and watched him fall asleep on the couch, exhaustion winning over pain. But I didn't sleep. I replayed every moment that led to this. Every invitation. Every "they mean well." Every time I ignored a small red flag because confronting it felt uncomfortable. And that's when I realized something terrifying. This wasn't the first time they'd made him feel small. It was just the coldest. I remembered the subtle comments. The jokes disguised as concern. The way they'd praise other children loudly and acknowledge mine quietly, if at all. I had called it imagination. I was wrong. That night, as I watched my son breathe unevenly under layers of blankets, one thought echoed in my mind. If I stay silent now, I'm teaching him that his pain is negotiable. And that was a lesson I refused to pass on. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that confronting them wouldn't just expose their behavior. It would expose the truth about who they believed we were. And once that truth is revealed, you can never unsee it. 2-inch when I spoke up, and they pretended nothing happened. The next morning, the house felt different. Not calm. Not peaceful. Tense. My son was still asleep when I sat at the kitchen table, phone in my hand, staring at the screen. I had typed the message at least 10 times, and erased it every single time. Because when you confront family, you don't just risk arguments, you risk being labeled difficult. But I kept seeing my child standing outside that restaurant window, pretending not to feel cold, pretending not to be hurt, pretending not to matter. And that made the decision for me. I sent the message. Simple. Polite. Controlled. I need to talk about what happened last night. Please call me. The phone rang less than a minute later. That should have warned me. Her voice was cheerful, too cheerful, like nothing unusual had happened. Hey? Everything okay? I took a deep breath. No, I said. It's not. Silence. Then I told her. Calmly. Clearly. No accusations. Just facts. You left my son outside in freezing weather for 2 hours while everyone ate inside. Another pause. Then came the laugh. Not loud. Not cruel. Dismissive. Oh, that? You're making it sound worse than it was. That sentence hit me like ice water. Worse than it was. She explained, quickly, confidently, as if she'd rehearsed it. There wasn't space inside. We didn't think he'd mind. He's young, he can handle cold. I felt my hands shaking. He's a child, I said. Not luggage you leave outside. She sighed. That sigh, the one people use when they think you're the problem. You're being emotional, she said. Nobody meant any harm. Nobody meant any harm. I asked the question that mattered most. Why didn't anyone check on him? Another pause. Then the truth slipped out, disguised as honesty. We assumed he'd tell us if there was a problem. That's when I realized something terrifying. They didn't see my son as someone to protect. They saw him as someone who should endure. I hung up shaking. But the conversation didn't end there. By afternoon, messages started coming in. Not apologies. Explanations. Justifications. One said, back in our day, kids were tougher. Another said, You're raising him too sensitive. And the worst one of all. He should be grateful he was invited at all. That sentence burned into me. Grateful? To be humiliated? I looked at my son sitting quietly in the living room, still wrapped in a hoodie, and I wondered how many times he'd already swallowed discomfort just to be polite. That's when I decided, this wasn't about one night. This was about pattern. So I asked him something I should have asked long ago. Has anything like this happened before? He hesitated. That hesitation broke my heart. Then he nodded. And once he started talking, he didn't stop. He told me about birthdays where he was forgotten in group photos. About family outings where he was always told to wait here. About jokes that landed on him and nowhere else. I thought it was normal, he said quietly. I thought maybe I just didn't fit. I hugged him so tightly he laughed nervously. Because children do that, they soften their pain to protect adults. And that's when I realized the most painful truth of all. I had been protecting peace instead of protecting my child. That evening, they called again. This time, I didn't stay calm. I wasn't rude. I wasn't screaming. But I was firm. What happened was unacceptable, I said. And until you acknowledge that, there will be distance. That word, distance, changed everything. Their tone shifted instantly. Now I was dramatic. Now I was divisive. Now I was breaking the family. They accused me of turning my son against them. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. My son didn't need turning, I said. You already showed him exactly where he stands. Silence. For the first time since this began, real silence. And in that silence, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Because speaking up didn't weaken me. It freed me. That night, my son asked a question that cut deeper than any insult. Am I allowed to say no next time? I looked at him and answered without hesitation. Yes. Always. And in that moment, I knew something had shifted. They thought this story was over. They were wrong. Because what came next wasn't just confrontation. It was consequence. 3-inch they called it family. I called it a line I wouldn't cross. After I set boundaries, the silence didn't last. It never does. Silence is only a pause before people decide which version of the story they want to tell and who they want to blame. By the third day, the phone started ringing again. Not just from one number, but many. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. Relatives who suddenly had opinions. People who knew only fragments, but spoke with full confidence. They weren't calling to ask how my son was. They were calling to tell me how wrong I was. One voice message said, "You're overreacting. You've always been sensitive." Another said, "Why are you turning a small misunderstanding into a family crisis?" A misunderstanding. As if 2 hours in freezing weather was a scheduling error. As if humiliation could be filed under miscommunication. I didn't respond at first. I wanted to protect my son from the noise. But the noise found its way in any way, through overheard conversations, through my tired eyes, through the tension that filled our home. One afternoon, my son asked quietly, "Are they mad at me?" That question hit harder than all the messages combined. Because when adults refuse accountability, children assume responsibility. "No," I said immediately. "They're mad because I spoke up." He nodded slowly, like he was processing something bigger than his age. "I don't want you to lose your family because of me," he said. That was it. That was the moment something inside me hardened into certainty. I knelt in front of him and said, "Anyone I lose by protecting you." I never truly had. That evening, they invited me to talk it out. Neutral location. Public space. Controlled environment. A table. 4 chairs. Too much history. They started softly. Calm voices. Concerned faces. "We're worried about you," one of them said. "You seem stressed." There it was. Not "we're sorry." Not "we heard him." But "you seem unstable." I listened as they spoke about unity, forgiveness, and tradition. About how families survive by overlooking mistakes. About how confrontation damages relationships. Then I asked one simple question. Would you do the same to your own child? The table went quiet. Someone cleared their throat. "That's different," they said. Different. Because some children deserve warmth and some deserve endurance. That's when the guilt tripping began. They reminded me of favors. Of past help. of sacrifices they believed they had made. "We've always included you," they said. "This is how you repay us?" I realized then that to them, kindness was transactional. I responded calmly. "Kindness that disappears when questioned isn't kindness." Their faces changed. The warmth vanished. One of them leaned forward and said the words they thought would end the conversation. "If you keep pushing this, you'll isolate yourself." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply said, "Then I'll be isolated with my child's dignity intact." That was the moment the meeting ended. Not officially, but emotionally. On the way home, my son was quiet. Then he said something that still echoes in my chest. "Mom, I don't feel scared anymore." I glanced at him. "Of what?" "Of them," he said. "Of disappointing people." I realized then, standing up hadn't just protected him. It had taught him permission. Permission to speak. Permission to leave. Permission to choose self-respect over approval. That night, I blocked numbers. Not out of anger. Out of clarity. And in that quiet, something unexpected happened. Peace. Not the fake peace of silence, but the real peace of alignment. But peace always has a price. Because once you stop accepting mistreatment, people who benefited from your silence get louder. And they weren't done yet. For inch when the story left the family, and the world took sides. I thought blocking numbers would end it. I was wrong. When people can't reach you directly, they reach around you. Through whispers. Through looks. Through stories told just loud enough for you to hear, and just twisted enough to hurt. It started subtly. A friend at work asked, "Is everything okay at home? You seem distant lately." A neighbor mentioned, "Families fight sometimes. You shouldn't hold grudges." I hadn't told them anything. Which meant someone else had. By the end of the week, I realized the story was no longer ours. It had been edited. Reframed. I was no longer a mother protecting her child, I was a woman creating drama. My son was no longer a child left in the cold, he was overly sensitive. And the people who humiliated him were suddenly the victims of my overreaction. That's how public judgment works. It doesn't ask what happened. It asks who told it first. One afternoon, my son came home from school quieter than usual. Not tired. Not moody. Withdrawn. I asked him what was wrong. He hesitated, again, that hesitation that now felt familiar. "Someone said something today," he finally admitted. My heart tightened. "What did they say?" He stared at the floor. "They said my mom hates her own family, and that's why no one invites us anymore." I felt the room spin. This wasn't just gossip anymore. This was damage. That night, I cried in the shower so he wouldn't hear me. Not because I regretted speaking up, but because I hadn't realized how far cruelty could travel when it was disguised as concern. The next day, I did something I never thought I would do. I told the truth. Not angrily. Not defensively. Publicly. I didn't name names. I didn't exaggerate. I simply shared what happened, a child left outside in freezing weather while others ate comfortably inside, and how it made him feel. I expected backlash. What I didn't expect was recognition. Messages came in quietly at first. "I believe you. This happened to me too. I wish my parent had done what you did." Women I barely knew. Parents I'd never spoken to. All saying the same thing in different words. "Thank you for saying what we were taught to swallow." But with support came retaliation. A post appeared, vague, but pointed. Some people confuse boundaries with bitterness. Victimhood is fashionable these days. I knew who it was for. And I knew who it was from. My son saw it too. He looked at me and asked, "Did we do something wrong by telling the truth?" That question shook me more than any insult. "No," I said firmly. "Truth doesn't become wrong just because it makes people uncomfortable." That evening, someone I once trusted reached out. "You could have handled this privately," they said. "Now everyone's talking." I replied, "It was private until my child became a public joke." Silence followed. What people don't tell you about standing up is this. Courage invites witnesses. And not all of them will clap. Some will watch, uncomfortable, because your strength forces them to examine their own silence. Others will attack, because admitting you're right means admitting they were wrong. And that's a price many people won't pay. By the end of the week, invitations stopped. Group chats went quiet. Smiles turned stiff. But something else happened too. My son's tu taller. He started speaking more freely. One night, as we were eating dinner, just the two of us, he said something that felt like a quiet victory. I don't feel invisible anymore. That's when I knew. Public judgment may be loud, but a child reclaiming his worth is louder. Still, I sensed the storm wasn't over. Because when people lose control of the narrative, they look for ways to regain it. And the next move they made? It crossed a line I didn't know existed. 5-inch when they couldn't control me, they tried to destroy me. I knew things had gone too far the day fear showed up at my door wearing the face of authority. It was a knock, firm, professional, unmistakable. When I opened the door, 2 people stood there. Calm. Polite. Clipboards in hand. Are you the parent of? One of them asked. My stomach dropped. They explained they were there because of a concern reported about my home. Concern. That word carries weight when it comes from strangers with power. They asked to come inside. I let them in. Not because I wasn't scared, but because I had nothing to hide. My son sat quietly on the couch, eyes wide, watching adults talk about him as if he weren't in the room. That alone made me furious. They asked questions. Routine questions. About school. About meals. About discipline. I answered calmly, even as my heart pounded. Then one of them asked, has there been recent conflict with extended family? I froze. I knew then. This wasn't random. Someone had called. Someone who was angry that I refused to stay silent. Someone who believed hurting me was the only way to regain control. After they left, satisfied, polite, unconcerned, I closed the door and slid down to the floor. My son knelt beside me. Are we in trouble? He whispered. That broke something in me. No, I said, pulling him close. We're safe. But inside, I was shaking. Because this wasn't about misunderstanding anymore. This was retaliation. That night, messages started again. This time, the tone was different. Cold. Calculated. You shouldn't have embarrassed us. You forced our hand. This could have been avoided. Avoided, if I had stayed quiet. I realized then how dangerous entitlement can be. People who believe they're untouchable don't apologize. They escalate. They accuse you of being unstable. Of being ungrateful. Of being unfit. All because you refused to let your child freeze for their comfort. I documented everything. Screenshots. Dates. Times. Not out of revenge, out of survival. Because when lies become weapons, evidence becomes armor. My son watched me organize papers one night and asked, why are they doing this? I struggled to answer without poisoning his innocence. Some people, I said carefully, don't know how to accept no. He thought for a moment, then said, then I'm glad you said it. That sentence kept me standing. But the pressure didn't stop. They told others I was unstable. That I was turning my child against family. That I was seeking attention. And still, not once, did they say sorry. Not once did they ask how my son felt. That told me everything. One night, after a particularly vicious message, I finally responded. Just once. This ends now. Any further contact will be through legal channels. The reply came quickly. You wouldn't dare. They underestimated me. Because they didn't understand something fundamental. I wasn't fighting them. I was protecting him. And when protection becomes the motive, fear loses its power. The next morning, I met with a lawyer. Not because I wanted war, but because I wanted peace backed by boundaries. Walking out of that office, I felt something unfamiliar. Strength. Not loud. Not aggressive. Quiet. Unshakable. But I also knew this. They wouldn't back down easily. People who try to destroy your credibility do so because they're afraid of your truth. And the next thing they tried? It shocked everyone. Including me. 6-inch the truth doesn't shout, it stands. People think justice arrives loudly. Sirens. Apologies. Public confessions. It doesn't. Most of the time, justice arrives quietly, with documents, dates, and a refusal to be intimidated. The lawyer listened without interrupting. Every message. Every screenshot. Every timeline. When I finished, she leaned back and said something I didn't expect. "They're not angry because you're wrong," she said. "They're angry because you stopped being easy." That sentence explained everything. We sent a formal notice. Clear. Professional. Unemotional. It didn't accuse. It didn't threaten. It drew a line. And lines terrify people who benefit from your silence. Within days, the tone changed again. Messages stopped. Posts disappeared. Whispers slowed. Not because they suddenly understood, but because they were afraid of consequences. Still, the damage lingered. My son asked me one night, "Why do adults lie so much?" I paused. "Because telling the truth would mean admitting they hurt someone," I said. He nodded slowly. "I don't want to be like that." That's when I realized this wasn't just about surviving conflict. It was about modeling integrity. A week later, something unexpected happened. One of them reached out. Not with anger. With fear. "I think things went too far," the message read. "We should talk." I agreed, but not alone. Not without boundaries. Not without witnesses. The meeting was short. No dramatics. No tears. Just discomfort. They tried to soften the story again. It wasn't meant that way. We didn't think it was that cold. We assumed he was fine. I looked at them and said something I'd practiced in my head 100 times. Intent doesn't erase impact. Silence followed. For the first time since this began, they didn't argue. They couldn't. Because the truth doesn't need defending, it just needs space. When I walked away from that meeting, I felt lighter. Not because they apologized, they didn't. But because I no longer needed them to. My son noticed the change immediately. "You look different," he said. "How?" "Like you're not scared anymore." He was right. Fear had been replaced by clarity. That evening, we did something simple. We went out to eat. Just us. We sat inside. Warm. Unrushed. Halfway through the meal, my son looked around and smiled. "I like this," he said. "I don't feel cold." I swallowed hard. Because that was never just about temperature. That was about belonging. That night, I understood something essential. Closure doesn't come from other people changing. It comes from you choosing not to carry their behavior anymore. But closure isn't the end. It's the beginning of something else. And what came next? It wasn't confrontation. It was growth. 7-inch healing isn't loud, it happens in small moments. People imagine healing as a moment. An apology. A hug. A dramatic turning point. But healing doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, in ordinary days, in small choices, in moments that almost go unnoticed unless you're looking for them. After everything slowed down, our house felt different. Not tense anymore. Still. Safe. The kind of silence that doesn't weigh on your chest. My son started sleeping better. No more sudden waking. No more pulling blankets tight around himself even when the room was warm. One morning, I noticed he'd left his jacket behind when going to school. It was cold outside. I almost stopped him, out of habit, but then I realized something. He trusted the world again. Not blindly. Not foolishly. But enough to move forward. We started talking more. Not about what happened, but about how it made him feel. He admitted something that stayed with me. "I thought being uncomfortable was normal," he said. "I thought saying nothing was being polite." That broke my heart in a new way. Because politeness should never require pain. So we talked about boundaries. About listening to that quiet voice inside that says this isn't right. I told him something I wish someone had told me earlier in life. You don't owe your discomfort to anyone. He repeated it, testing the words like they were new shoes. I don't owe my discomfort to anyone. Healing began there. At school, teachers noticed the change. He raised his hand more. He spoke with confidence. He stopped apologizing for existing. One evening, he came home excited. "I said no today," he announced. My heart jumped. "To what?" I asked. "Someone wanted me to wait while they played," he said. "I didn't want to." I smiled. "That's good." He smiled back, proud, not guilty. That's how you know healing is working. Not when pain disappears, but when self-trust replaces fear. We also created new traditions. Small ones. Friday dinners. Evening walks. Hot chocolate on cold nights. Things that said, without words, "You belong here." One night, as we sat together watching snow fall outside, he asked a question that surprised me. "Do you think they miss us?" I thought carefully before answering. "Maybe," I said. "But missing someone isn't the same as knowing how to treat them." He nodded. "I don't miss feeling small," he said. Neither did I. Healing didn't mean pretending nothing happened. It meant remembering without reopening wounds. It meant choosing peace without erasing truth. And slowly, I noticed something else. I was healing too. I stopped second-guessing myself. Stopped replaying conversations. Stopped wondering if I'd been too much. Because protecting your child will never be too much. One night before bed, my son hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you for believing me." That was the moment I knew. The cycle had broken. But healing has a way of testing itself. Just when you think you're steady, life checks your balance. And the next test? It came from a place I didn't expect. 8-inch when they came back, and I finally understood what forgiveness is. Just when life began to feel steady again, the past knocked softly. Not aggressively. Not with accusations. Carefully. The message came late at night. "I've been thinking about everything. Can we talk?" I stared at the screen for a long time. Because healing doesn't erase memory, it teaches discernment. I didn't respond immediately. I watched my son sleeping, his face calm, his breathing even. The same child who once stood outside in freezing cold, now wrapped safely in warmth. That image answered the message for me. We agreed to meet. Public place. Short time. Clear boundaries. They arrived looking different. Not apologetic, tired. Life has a way of humbling people when control slips away. They started by talking about themselves. How hard the past months had been. How misunderstood they felt. How family had fallen apart. Then came the words I had waited for, but not in the way I expected. "I'm sorry you felt hurt." There it was. Not we hurt him. Not we were wrong. Just discomfort over consequences. I let the silence stretch. Then I spoke. "Forgiveness isn't pretending something didn't happen," I said. "It's deciding whether trust can exist again." They looked uncomfortable. "Are you saying you won't forgive us?" One asked. I answered honestly. "I'm saying forgiveness doesn't mean access." That truth seemed to land heavier than anger ever could. They asked about my son. Not directly. Carefully. "How is he doing?" I smiled softly. "He's warm," I said. They nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing the meaning. Before leaving, one of them said something unexpected. "We never thought he'd remember." That sentence revealed everything. I looked them in the eye. Children remember how you made them feel long after they forget what you said. We stood up. No hug. No closure speech. Just clarity. On the way home, my son asked, "Did they say sorry?" "Yes," I said. "Was it a real one?" I thought for a moment. It was the best they could do. He nodded. "That's okay," he said. "I don't need them to like me." That's when I realized something profound. Forgiveness isn't for the person who caused harm. It's for the person who refuses to carry it anymore. And boundaries? Boundaries are how you protect that freedom. That night, we talked about something new. The future. Not fearfully. Hopeful. Plans. Dreams. Choices. No shadows from the past. But every story that heals leaves behind a lesson. And the final lesson in ours? It didn't come from them. It came from him. Joe, the lesson I wish every parent heard in time. Some lessons arrive too late. Others arrive just in time to change everything. What happened to my son could have become a quiet scar, the kind children carry into adulthood without knowing where it came from. A small memory that turns into self-doubt. A moment that teaches them to accept less than they deserve. But it didn't. Because someone spoke. And that's the lesson. Not that the world is kind, but that silence is optional. I started noticing how often we tell children to adjust. Adjust to discomfort. Adjust to disrespect. Adjust to adults' mistakes. We call it maturity. But it's not. It's training. Training them to ignore their instincts. Training them to stay quiet when something feels wrong. Training them to confuse endurance with strength. I watched my son grow in ways that surprised me. He stopped shrinking himself in rooms. Stopped waiting for permission to matter. Stopped measuring his worth by other people's comfort. And I realized something uncomfortable. Children don't learn boundaries by being told. They learn by watching. They watch how we respond when they're hurt. They watch who we defend. They watch what we tolerate. And then they decide how much they deserve. That night outside the restaurant could have taught my son that love is conditional. Instead, it taught him this. If someone asks you to freeze for their comfort, you're allowed to walk away. That's not rebellion. That's self-respect. I don't regret speaking up. Not the awkward conversations. Not the lost relationships. Not the judgment. Because every child deserves at least one adult who will be inconvenient on their behalf. One adult who will risk being disliked to ensure they feel safe. One adult who will say, "No, this ends here." I used to believe protecting peace meant keeping quiet. Now I know peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of dignity. And dignity, once taught, lasts longer than fear ever could. My son said something recently that told me everything I needed to know. He said, "If something feels wrong, I won't stay just to be polite." I smiled. Because that's not defiance. That's confidence. And confidence is the inheritance I want to leave him. If this story made you uncomfortable, that's okay. Growth usually is. Backhand index pointing right. Let me ask you something, honestly. If your child came home and whispered what mine did, what would you do? Would you choose peace, or would you choose protection? And how many moments like this go unspoken because we're afraid of causing problems? Backhand index pointing down. Comment below, not with judgment, but with truth. Your answer might help another parent find courage tonight. Backhand index pointing right. Like this video if you believe children deserve dignity over tradition. Backhand index pointing right. Subscribe. Chapter 10 is the final chapter, and it brings everything together. Backhand index pointing right. Share this with someone who needs permission to speak up.